Good morning, everybody. My name is Clint Walker. I am with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and I'm joined by Mr. Jason Hemingway, the master, who is the cybersecurity advisor here for Augusta, Georgia, who also represents CISA. How many of you have heard of CISA before? How many of you think CISA is the greatest thing since sliced bread? Just those CISA people. So, for those of you who don't know, CISA is the nation's risk manager. We are out there both for federal network protection and for private sector, critical infrastructure, state and local governments. We are out there giving advice on how to identify, manage, and disrupt risk. We are out there trying to make the world a better place. So when I look at you and say, my name is Clint Walker, I'm from the federal government, and I'm here to help, that's not a joke. You can still laugh at it, though, because it kind of is. All right, so I represent Region 4, so we are the 8 states here in the southern United States. So back when we started the Cybersecurity Advisor Program, I was CSA number 7, so I covered all 8 states by myself. So that's North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So they told me 20% travel when I took the job, and I was on the road about 97% of the time, because there's always somebody that needs help or something going on. So our life is never boring. We might be at a nuclear power plant one day, a mom and pop burger shop the next day, and then at a Fortune 50 company the day after that. So in the audience here too, I just want to point out that I do have our vulnerability and threat team, or our pen testers and stuff like that represented. So if you have questions for any of them, they'd be happy to answer those after or even during. This is as interactive as you want it to be. If you have a question, you want to go off, you want to tell one of your own stories, we're happy to give up the microphone to let you do that too. But we're here to talk about the supply chain. How many of you would bet your career that everybody you do business with is secure? How many of you bet your career every day, though, that everybody that you do business with is secure? I mean, that's what most people don't realize, is how little control they have over their own cybersecurity program. That you are relying on other people to do things for you. And that communication, that security handoffs, those are very important things that not many people talk about. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is do you really understand the threats that are out there? Do you really understand what the landscape looks like? Are you prepared for disruptions that you have no control over? So, for those of you who have seen me speak before, and I apologize for that, I always start with a little bit of an ode to my father, because my father is my personal hero. My father's retired Air Force after 26 years. I watched him, I grew up all over the world. And one of the things my dad always told me is that life is about the little things. And so this is a story that's been attributed to many great leaders throughout history that he always talked about. He said, for want of a nail. And this is the supply chain in general, because without the nail, you couldn't put a horseshoe on a horse. Without the horse, you couldn't have a rider deliver a message. Without the message, the battle was lost. And without the battle, the kingdom was lost. Very important information there. But I've updated this for today's world, because it's all about the data. Data that's in an asset. Without that asset, you can't have a process. Without process, you can't have a system that delivers an operation that allows you to give your service that completes your mission. And that's what we're talking about. And data is not just in computers. We're talking about data that's in paper. We're talking about data that's in people's head. How many of you have ever had somebody retire or leave and 20 years of knowledge goes out the door with them, and you wish you could have that knowledge back, right? That's all part of the supply chain too, is how do you plan for contingencies? How do you do succession planning? How are you making sure that you're always operating at peak efficiency, or at least something sustainable? So that's what we're looking at here, is how do we protect data in all of its facets as it moves through to allow us to accomplish our mission? Because the threat actors can attack any point of that. They can attack the data itself, they can attack the asset, the processes, the system, the operation of the service. All of those things in order for us to lose our mission. And that's what we're looking at. And this is what we talk about, and this is that same thing that we just talked about, but in a different diagram. Is that with our mission, with our assets, we have people, information, technology, and facilities. If you were to disrupt any one of those things, you start to impact operations, which may mean you lose one or more services, which means you've lost your mission. And so for some of you, losing your mission means people losing their lives. And that's really the big thing here. And people ask me, like, what was the turning point in my career? When did I really understand cybersecurity? I'd say even to this day, I don't really completely, fully understand it. But when I joined the intelligence community, so I was a civilian in the intelligence community. I'd been in the banking industry for a while, so doing penetration tests and securing banking networks, and it was all about money. And I came over to the DoD. I'm on the job for about 3 months at this point in time. And they called me into a room, a lot of generals, a lot of colonels in the room. I don't really know what's going on. I'm just, smiling, happy to be there kind of person. I'm in my, late 20s, and they sit down and they say, hey, Clint, what do you think about this network? What can we do to make this better? And I look at it and I say, hey, we could put a honeypot over here, we could do this. I gave them all kinds of suggestions. They're like, okay, so if one of our assets is compromised, this is gonna help us. I said, well, can we walk through this one more time for me? And they said, if one of our assets out in the field has a gun to their head and being told to log back into our network so they can exfiltrate secrets, this will allow us to feed them false information and everything in order to keep this, keep our information protected. And I said, so what we're designing here decides whether somebody lives or dies on the other end? He said, yes. I said, do you mind if I have a couple more days to look this over? I'd like to give it a little bit better. And that was kind of my turning point where I realized I wasn't just protecting money anymore. I was protecting people's lives. And then I started to think about it more, and as my career has progressed, that's what we're all doing. It's protecting people's lives or their livelihood, because that's what it's about. I mean, think about people who are living on the edge of a paycheck, people who can't afford not to have a job, and how many businesses go under because of cyber attacks. That is what we're doing, is we're defending people's ability to feel good about their job and to keep sustaining and providing for themselves. But that's my soapbox for the moment. How many of you know why we use the term cybersecurity now? Anybody? It's not just a buzzword. So I've been doing this since the 90s. And we were called computer security when we first started. And then we were called network security. And then we were called system security. And then for a short while we were information security. And then we were information assurance. How many of you remember that little buzzword? And now they call us cyber. Well, cyber's not just a buzzword. Cyber is actually a conglomeration of things that we've put together. Cyber is because we're no longer just looking at information technology systems. We are looking at information technology, operational technology, and the Internet of Things. So they changed one word. We went from being information assurance to cybersecurity, and our job tripled and we didn't even realize it. How many of you got that triple bonus paycheck though, right? No. So that's what we're looking at, is everything from building automation, badge access systems, camera systems, environmental control systems, transportation systems. You can't work on a car anymore without a computer degree. We're looking at automation and production, artificial intelligence. We're looking at healthcare. How many of you would like to see somebody, or would worry about somebody, being able to put malware into heart monitors or life support systems? That's actually what we're looking at these days, is people being able to do these things. Would you pay a ransom where somebody's life right then and there was laying on the line? Threat actors are looking at any way they can get an advantage to make us do what they want. So, supply chain is on everybody's topics these days, and it's a really big talk, so much so that the President signed Executive Order 14017 that looks at to strengthen the resilience of U.S. supply chains. So I don't have this slide up there. I'm not going to talk through all this fun stuff. But this is how important it is that the White House, that the President's office is saying, hey, this is a serious issue. We have to do something about it. And so they've tasked CISA, and we created, the ICT Scrum, which allows us to have a task force aimed at identifying the risks around supply chain. So everything that we talk about today, there's going to be some resources that are out there to help you, some guides and some things that we can point you to on our website, and as well as all of our assessments, which Jason will talk about here a little bit later. Any questions so far? Are we having fun? All right. So one of the things that we do at CISA is we have an assessment called the External Dependency Management. And this is a 4-hour assessment where we go into organizations and we talk them through, have they really looked at what their supply chain is? Or have they looked at how they fit into a supply chain? And for sake of simplicity, it really breaks your supply chain down into 3 major parts. Vendors and suppliers, or I like to say people you have a contract with. So these are people where you have some control over their cybersecurity because you can write it in your contract that they must do X to point Y. This is the thing that most people don't do though. I see so many organizations that as soon as the vendor slides over the contract, they just sign it without looking to say what is actually in it. Do I have my recovery time objectives, my recovery point objectives? Am I asking for 5 nines uptime? All of that could be written into the contract. Whose security responsibility is what? Who's the data owner? Who's the data custodian? All that fun stuff right there. Then we have our infrastructure providers. These are people you don't normally have a contract with, and yet you can still have a relationship with them and talk to them about all the things that go into them helping you with your organization. And then the last is public services, whether that be law enforcement, emergency management, FBI, CISA, Postal Service. There's so much that go into public services that you rely on. Most people don't even know how to contact law enforcement when they have an incident. They don't know who they should go to. Should they go to the DOD? Should they go to the FBI? Should they go to, Barney Fife down the street? That's questions that you really want to find out before you have a cyber incident. And who are your regulators? Who are the people that you actually have to report to? And then is Barney Fife going to have the ability to help you with a cyber attack? Or is that FBI level? Or is that CISA level? Those are the things that we'd like to come in and help you figure out before they happen. So let me take a drink here real fast. Let me look at this slide. How many of you have seen this slide before? Not this particular slide, but the triad. I love this slide. These are the 3 pillars of cybersecurity, but these are also the things that we talk about on the reverse side, and that's what I'm going to actually focus on. We all know about protecting confidentiality, availability, integrity. But let's think about this from the attacker's perspective for a moment. The attackers use these same 3 pillars. They have confidentiality attacks, they have integrity attacks, and they have availability attacks. Availability gets most of the press out there, ransomware. It's making something unavailable to you. That's how they get you to pay. Confidentiality attacks are where they might be stealing information, exfiltration attacks, they're going to make it public. Also maybe extortionware, that sort of thing. What most people don't look at is that middle piece, which is actually the scariest of the pieces, is the integrity attack. That's where they get in your network and they live in your network and they're changing things without you knowing about it. They might be making your steel a little less strong so that the Chinese steel looks better than US steel. They might be making some changes to make that Kevlar vest not as strong as it should be. Maybe the prototype is good, but the rest of it isn't. Or they're injecting things into code for it to go out. They might be creating bank accounts for fictitious people or for real people and changing the amount of money in them. Those are integrity attacks. Those are live off the land type of things where they're in your network. Going back to Stuxnet and things like that, where it's like, hey, we don't want to stop you from enriching uranium. We want to make sure that it never happens, or it happens very, very slowly. Those are integrity attacks. That is what a lot of the more advanced adversaries are more interested in, is how long can they live in a network and make minor changes to the network that might cause little disruptions here and there to increase their foothold. So as a supply chain, there are certain challenges that you want to look at. Design challenges, development and production. We don't get to see all this as users of a lot of this stuff. It's just that we like to preach secure by design. So far right now, it's a great initiative, it's a great talking point out there, but until people buy into it, how many of you would trust any device that you bought that this device is going to be secure right the moment that you buy it, but then also be secure a year from now? Yeah, nobody's hand went up. We don't trust the very things that we're buying. Why don't we trust them? Who's accountable if it isn't? That's the big question that we have. Who's being held accountable if something is not secure? I always like to talk about this, but how many of you remember, and this is going back, I guess, a long time now, when New York lost one of the core routers of the internet? It went down because of a denial of service attack. And what we found out a lot is those denial of service attacks was caused when a lot of these Internet of Things devices all phoned home at the same time. It was because these hackers, for lack of a better term, they found out that most of these, so let's make this really easy and say there were 2 types of cameras. This was back when everybody was trying to get those cameras for their home, the home security cameras. There were 2 cameras on the market. One was $20 and had admin as the default password, which could not be changed. And the other was a $120 camera, which allows you to integrate it into your home network, and you could change the password, had nice security around it. Which one do you think the public bought? The $20 camera. So these people just set up a script that said, hey, all these cameras out there, admin, phone home. And they all did, and they took the internet down. Amazon lost billions of dollars that day. because they couldn't do any business. That's what we're looking at. It's not one person accepting responsibility. When they buy these $20 cameras, they're putting all of us at risk. That is a shared environment that we're looking at, and that's what we're talking about here in design and development. We're talking about if you're not doing things right the first time, you're causing a conflict for everybody. And then distribution, we'll talk about a lot of these a little bit later here. But acquisition. Acquisition could be everything from counterfeit goods to just going down to Best Buy to buy things, or accepting things at a vendor hall that might have malware already installed on it. And then maintenance, and then of course disposal. Those are your challenges. It's how can you do all of those things securely? Because there are threats out there. Your first threat that you have is somebody is attacking part of your supply chain to cause a domino effect disruption that comes to you. So how many of you remember Colonial Pipeline? I was lucky enough to be the CISA representative in the war room of Colonial Pipeline when it happened. And let me tell you that, at first it didn't look like things were that bad, but then it cascaded. And then it just wasn't, Colonial Pipeline that was hit. It was all the airports. It was all the emergency services. It was everybody that needed gas. Suddenly it became a catastrophe. We had states declaring a national emergency, all because one entity got hit. Trusted communications, solar winds. The threat actors used, the trusted communication between solar wind and all of its appliances in order to make back doors. So they used a product that you already use, that you already trust. How many of you verify everything that every vendor has, update every patch that comes through? No, and that's what they did. Data exfiltration, we'll talk more about the Paradise. How many of you have heard of the Paradise Papers? Anybody? We'll talk about the Paradise Papers just a little bit. Living off the land. So this is your advanced persistent threats. These are your people that want to get into your networks and they want to live there. And I'm going to talk to you about island hopping, or what I used when I did pen testing. I call it the Kevin Bacon attack. I never attacked the company I wanted to attack directly. I always looked 7 degrees downstream, and I said, the smallest widget supplier they have, that's who I'm going to attack, and I'm going to worm my way up into where I actually want to be. This is what the good ones do. Staging grounds or domestic addresses. This is something most people don't think about. Everybody's like, oh, I'm just a small company, why would anybody attack me? Well, I got to hide my ill-gotten goods somewhere. I got to take all the data I've exfiltrated from everybody else and put it somewhere. One of the first investigations I ever did, I worked for a company, and we got a notice from Sony saying, we're suing you for $25 million for hosting an illegal copy of our entire music and movie library. So this is going back to the Napster days. And we're like, hey, we're a small automotive company. Why would we have any of Sony stuff? But we checked our networks, and sure enough, somebody had set up an FTP server on one of our servers and was hosting Sony's entire library. It was somebody who found an open door into our network and had put their stuff there and was using it to distribute to everybody else. Who was liable for that? We were. We actually ended up having to pay that, much lesser of an amount, because it came down to how much were we at fault there. But the other thing is that the bad guys might be using your network to attack other people's networks, because you have one thing they don't have, and that's a domestic IP address. With a lot of companies using like geolocation blocking and things like that, the bad guys are using small companies in the US to attack larger companies because they have a US-based IP address. So it could be something as simple as that. And then of course we've got accidents and technical failures, such as what happened with CrowdStrike. And I won't talk about that too much because the wound's too fresh, right, for most of us. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering why you consider that, when we're talking cybersecurity, why specifically you mentioned CrowdStrike to be, as it was, technical failure, connected to cybersecurity.
Because we're talking about protection of networks.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is why would I consider CrowdStrike, because it was an accident or technical failure, to be a cyber attack? And it's not that I necessarily call it a cyber attack, it is a cyber incident. And the reason I say that is because it still was disruptive to lots of different places. Your job as a cybersecurity expert, or as a person, an owner, custodian of a network, is to protect the network from anything that happens. Natural disasters, floods, but also technical and accidents. So you're saying, well, I can't protect myself against those things. No, but you can make your network more resilient so that those things don't impact you as much. You can, find ways, and that's talking with your vendors, making sure that they understand, once again, what is written in the contract. Are you able to get some financial compensation back from them? How much at fault are they? But also just looking at how your network, if you're using a zero trust architecture network, which is what CISA promotes, how much of an impact would that have been ultimately? That's what the real questions is are you really looking at this from an all of hazards effect to your networks to say, are we protecting against things, even the things that we can't think about or can't control? Does that answer your question? So for those of you who've not seen a cyber attack, this is kind of the quick, mechanics of a cyber attack. And, so everything starts with reconnaissance. And I'll tell you, back in the days when I did penetration testing and stuff like that, reconnaissance for me was a 2-week to 2-month period where I tried to find out as much about a company as I could. I was constantly probing and pinging. And now with, certain websites and things out there, I can do reconnaissance in 5 or 10 minutes. I have AI automating a lot of things. I can have AI build me an entire attack routine against a company in a matter of minutes. With all the data that's out there, not even have to touch the company. It used to be where it's like I was going around rattling the doors, shaking the windows, all those fun things from a cyber perspective. So they kind of got an inkling maybe somebody was looking at them. But these days, I don't even touch their network in order to build that attack routine. So the initial compromise gets in, and then they're going to escalate privileges. They're going to try and find some way to get higher network, credentials and things like that. And then they're going to use that to discover everything on the network, move laterally. And that's where, when we talk about penetration testing, we have that vertical strike, can somebody get in from the outside? But then there's that secondary part is, can they move laterally through your networks? In a zero trust architecture, that's what you're trying to stop there, is that lateral movement, trying to keep them from getting those escalated privileges or trying to find other things in the network until they get to the point where they're completing their mission. And you notice we just say completing their mission because we don't know what their mission is. I usually tell people that, everybody's like, oh, ransomware. I'm like, ransomware is usually the last thing they want to do to you. When you get hit with ransomware, that means they've done everything else with their network that they wanted to do, and this is how they cover their tracks. Because a lot of times what you're going to do with ransomware, you're going to recover from backups, and so all the things that they did, they're gone because you don't have access to those log files anymore. You're recovering from something 24 hours ago or 5 hours ago or whatever, and they did everything all in that time period where you're not going to be able to recover that. So you might not ever be able to find patient zero or how they got in the first place. So this is that supply chain attack I talked about, that island hopping. And this is what we're seeing a lot of threat actors moving toward these days, is where they're using a vendor, a supplier, an infrastructure provider, they're targeting them in order to get into their networks, and then they're hopping from that. So we worked a case with the FBI, and this is once again going back a few years, but what we found is that there was a company, the threat actors really wanted to get at this company, so they started attacking all of their vendors. And what they would do is they would get into the vendor's network and they would look for invoices. And they would attach their malware to these invoices, and they would let these invoices go out then to the customer. And so, is that customer going to open that invoice? Yeah, they expect it. You're doing business, somebody, you expect to get a bill, you expect to pay a bill. So they were opening these invoices, which would then, put malware on their systems and trying to get the back door. And what we found is the farther up the food chain you went, somebody was always finding this malware, and they were cleaning it up, and then just paying the invoice and letting it go. And we're like, well, did you ever tell them that they were sending you malware? They're like, yeah, that's their problem. So these companies were all still, had bad guys in them, and they just would clean the malware every month and then pay the bill and never tell them that they were actually already hacked. So they just kept spreading to more and more of their vendors as they started moving laterally through their vendors and infrastructure providers, until at one point they finally got through. They found that one little kink in the armor there. So that's what the threat actors are doing. They're coming at you from multiple different angles. They're not going to attack you directly. They're going to attack your supply chain and then use trusted communications, whether it be like, the Target breach where they use the HVAC system to get into the Target network. Things like that is what you're looking at. SolarWinds is another great example. Jason, anything you want to say? No. Best color name in the business. I'm not going to focus on this here too terribly much. How am I doing on time still? All right. I tend to, I'm a walker by name, but a talker by trade. So we have counterfeit parts, attacks on operations and capabilities, system development lifecycle, extended supply chain. Do you trust the supply chain of your supply chain kind of thing? We're seeing a lot more questions and questionnaires going out these days that say, hey, widget supplier, do you also require supply chain management from the people that you do business with? So how can I trust you if you don't trust, if you're trusting people that work for you without verifying what they're doing, that sort of thing. I want to point out here insider threat. This one is always key because insider threat is still king. We have two different categories of insider threat these days. We have the advertent insider, which is that person who's looking to do harm to you or that's looking to cause some sort of disruption. But we also have the inadvertent insider. And that's the person who refuses to follow security processes or is what we call the network cowboy. They're doing things. Those are the people that can be social engineered. They're clicking on links, opening attachments. My first mentor used to always tell me, salespeople gotta sell. They don't get fired for having a security, thing. They get fired for not meeting their sales goals. So if they have to bypass security in order to make their sales goal, guess what they're going to do? They're going to bypass security. So that's what you're up against. But when you look at your supply chain, insider threat gets a lot more complicated. How many of you use the cloud? How many of you know all the employees that work for the cloud? These people have direct access into your cloud environment. Do you know who they are? Did you require the cloud company to do background investigations on their employees? Did they tell you when somebody was fired because they had a grudge against the company? We have seen people that had worked for a company, whether it be a managed service provider or cloud provider, that are disgruntled with their people, so they actually try and do things to make their reputation look bad, which means attacking or stealing their customers' data. When you look at your supply chain, every link of your supply chain, the insider threat just starts to magnify as you are trusting the insiders and everybody else that they have. One of the questions we ask in a lot of our assessments is does everybody that comes to your network have a unique log-on and ID in order to get in your network? They're like, oh no, we use group accounts. Our vendor just uses one, HP account or whatever you want to have. And they're like, well then how do you know what happened? It's like, we don't care which one of their employees did something bad because we're going to hold the whole company accountable. I was like, all right, that's your choice. But that's what you're looking at is that insider threat starts to grow as you start to look at all of your different supply chain needs. So we're going to do a couple of quick lessons learned. Anybody have any questions or comments at this point in time? I love audience stories. You guys have the best stories. My stories are old. I've heard them a million times. How many of you were ready for COVID when it hit? How many of you know that COVID even hit? Anybody? Yeah. COVID was something that, from us in the cybersecurity professional field, this was a game changer for us. A lot of networks out there, they protected the perimeter. But what do you do when your workforce suddenly is no longer behind that perimeter? The number of people that then needed to telework, needed remote access to the network, and we just had to do that overnight in order to keep business operations going. It didn't necessarily scale with our cybersecurity solutions. And how many of us have gone back to the old way of doing networks? Hardly anybody. It's a new world where people are now remote. People are working from just about anywhere. We have to protect people's personal machines and personal networks at home because that's where people are attaching their computers to. That's the things that you have to think about is how did COVID really change things? But then on the other side, COVID was also, how many of you remember Operation Warp Speed? Everybody working together because we were worried about foreign nations trying to disrupt our ability to create a vaccine or to distribute that vaccine. And when you look at all the different ways that they could have done that, imagine if they could have made us stop making cotton swabs. You're like, well, what's the importance of a cotton swab? Well, you couldn't do the swab test without cotton swabs, right? They didn't need to actually hit the vaccine to make us from getting the vaccine. They could have hit the cotton swabs. They could have made us hit the trucks that would deliver the thing. They could have hit the refrigeration units that kept the vaccines at a certain temperature. When you start to look at how an adversary, if you start to think like the bad guy, and you can think of all the ways that they can disrupt something without touching the something, you'd be amazed. But you have to think like them. And when you're defending your networks, that's what you need to do. If I was to look at any single line of your operations and say, if I was a threat actor or just bad luck, what could I do to make us lose what we're doing today? And how do I defend or protect myself or become resilient to bounce back from that? All right, let me take a drink here. Anybody have a fun COVID story?
Yeah.
Nobody? Is there anybody in this room that survived without ever getting COVID? I'm always curious. Nice. Was it hibernation? All right, one of my favorite stories, not many people have heard about this, is the Paradise Papers. So one of the things about the Paradise Papers, and there's lots of different variations of it out there, but the Paradise Papers were these hacktivists, these people were saying, I really want to get access to some information. And the companies that I'd like to get that information from, these companies take a lot of time and a lot of effort in order to secure their networks. I don't know how I can gain access to that. And then somebody said, you know what? All of these companies, in order to do their business, they need to do all that through a law firm. Anything that they want to buy, anything they want to sell, anything that they want to try and do tax things for, any intellectual property, all that goes through law firms, right? Guess who doesn't secure their networks very well? Law firms. So these threat actors, these hacktivists, actually attacked a handful of law firms, stole all of their information, and it was all the intellectual property and all the findings and everything like that for these major players throughout the world. This still has repercussions to this day because they trusted their data with somebody who was not putting security controls around it, was not doing security the way that they were doing security. This, in my mind, is one of the biggest things you can take away from this is, do you know where your data is? Do you know how your data is being secured? For those of you who raised your hand with the cloud, how is that cloud securing your data? Because I'm going to tell you right now, they're probably not. They're securing their infrastructure. That is their job, is to make sure the infrastructure is there for you. Their job is not to secure your data. Your job is to secure the data on there. And most people aren't doing that. So that's what we're looking at here. SolarWinds, and I won't get into this too detail, everybody kind of knows SolarWinds, but this is where, once again, threat actors got into SolarWinds. This is a one-to-many attack. They could attack one company, get into that one company, and use their trusted communications to then gain access to over 18,000 other organizations. Some of the repercussions from this are also still being felt today as we find out more and more about what was stolen during the SolarWinds. I think Microsoft has had some very critical information stolen from them, including how they architect their web design in general was stolen during that attack. So the basis for how we do security on just about everything was part of the SolarWinds breach, and nobody's really talking about it. So, Volt Typhoon. You guys want to talk about Volt Typhoon? No? You want me to talk about it?
Kick it off.
How many of you have heard of Volt Typhoon? I hope every hand in here goes up. You know, and there's a lot we can't say because of the classification of a lot of this and stuff like that, but let's just say that China is very interested in everything that we do. If you look at how China has been able to, from a technology standpoint, go from being hundreds of years behind us to being only a few years behind us, and how they're able to create, build, sustain technology, I mean, this is what they're doing. But now, cyber is a weapon. The last several wars that have been attacked, a cyber attack has preceded any kinetic strike that was done. Taking out communications, trying to disrupt operations before the first boot hit the ground. Happened in the Ukraine, happened in, Desert Storm, all that fun stuff. This is what we're looking at. And these days, every country is trying to pre-position itself into the critical infrastructure of every other organization or every other nation. Imagine if Taiwan and China merge, and China looks at the United States and says, stay out of this, and I'm going to start disrupting your energy grid to make the people at home, because you think voters really care what happens in Taiwan? You think voters really care? They want their refrigerator to stay cold, right? They want to be able to charge their Teslas. That's what they're doing. They're using it as a political weapon to say, we're going to disrupt you to make you stay out of our foreign affairs. They're pre-positioning themselves just in case they ever need to do that. They could use it for a full scale, but I doubt that they'll turn into a kinetic attack. At least I'm going to hope it never turns into a kinetic attack. But they're doing it as a political, almost, the old standoff or the Cold War. It's the cyber Cold War is what we're looking at. They're saying, I have gained access to your networks, not only to steal your intellectual property, but to pre-position myself to cause massive disruptions to make your own people not worry about what's going on other places in the world. That's Volt Typhoon in a nutshell. They're targeting transportation systems, communication systems, energy, water systems. That's what they're looking at doing. And they're using living off the land techniques. So they're trying to not bring their own tools in. Like I said, they want to become part of your network. They actually like to target organizations that were just hit by a cyber attack, because guess what you do after a cyber attack? You re-baseline your organization, at least you should be re-baselining your organization. So they want to get into your organization so that they can become part of the new baseline, so that they live there now permanently. So that's what they're looking to do. And this is just a little graphic on how they kind of carry that out. If, you can have access to that in the slide deck, but just so they know, they're doing a lot of this. They're very good at the reconnaissance. I remember back when I first joined the intelligence community, my commander came up to me, he shook my hand, and the very first thing out of his mouth was, "Welcome to the Chinese watch list." He said, "The Chinese government now knows who you are, they know that you work for us, and they're going to start to send you some really low credit card offers because they want to own your debt. They're going to buy the mortgage for your house because they want to know if you're not making your payments, or they're going to offer to come in and help you if you ever have trouble." That's the Chinese government for you. They play the long game. And that's exactly what they're doing with Volt Typhoon. And a lot of what they're doing is they're trying to come in the United States through manufacturing. How many of you have heard of PAX? PAX. PAX is one of the largest point-of-sale businesses in the world. Billions of companies or billions of endpoints are covered by PAX point-of-sale systems. How many of you know that a couple of years ago, the FBI raided the Jacksonville warehouse of PAX and took all the equipment away because it was found to already have Chinese malware embedded in the firmware, backdoors already open, and keystroke loggers that were reverting back to China. These are things that are in every point-of-sale, through businesses all throughout the United States. That's the Chinese goal. They want to use companies like Huawei. They want to use things like TikTok. I'm not pointing those out specifically, I'm just saying those might be examples. If they're going to try and come to us with these low-cost goods, with Temu, whatever it's going to be, thumb drives given to people, they're embedding their malware and their backdoors and their keystroke loggers in these devices, their counterfeit devices. That's how they're trying to come into the country, as well as these direct attacks. Because that's the key. We live in a world of big data, and big data is about being able to attack even small targets. You might not think you're somebody today, but you might know somebody, or you might be somebody tomorrow. China is willing to wait to figure that out. They're going after individuals. I will tell everybody here, if you look me up on LinkedIn, I'm happy to connect with you, but do not trust anybody on my LinkedIn network, because I like talking to Russian and Chinese bots. I invite them to be part of my network because I like to talk to them, I like to see what their capabilities are. So don't trust anybody else in my network. Don't say, "Oh, they're friends with Clinton, they can be friends with me." That's not a good thing. But this is how you're being targeted. If social media existed back when I did pen testing, I'd have been a god. The ways that you can do it. And I have people to this day are always telling me, it's like, "Well, I don't have a social media account." I'm like, "Well, that's not good, because if you don't have one, that means somebody's created one for you and is using it to be you." How many of you, for your own companies or your own organizations, have ever gone out on LinkedIn to see who is claiming to be part of your organization? And that's what happened with the MGM. The guy created an account that said he worked for MGM, started social engineering people, and then pointed to his own help desk to say, "Hey, look, this is really me, I work for you," and they gave him access to the network. That's what we're looking at here, using social media. I used to be able to go out and look at companies. One of my favorite ways to social engineer companies was I would create an email. I would look for when a company was doing something really well, like they just had a great quarter or something, and I'd send an email out to everybody. I'd say, "Hey, everybody, we had a great quarter. We want to reward the employees. We're going to have Food Truck Friday." Food is always the key. Food Truck Friday. Expect long lines in order to order from the food trucks, or click here to pre-order your stuff. Everybody clicked the pre-order. Of course, my most successful phishing email was always, "This is a phishing email. Please don't click the link below," with a big arrow pointing to it. And people clicked on that. But that's what you're looking at. When you're doing reconnaissance, job postings, dumpster diving, all those things are still in effect to this day. And I want to make sure that Jason's got plenty of time here, so I'm going to hand it over to him. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Howdy. So, that's pretty good about getting big scary, but I'm more of a helper. A lot of times when I roll in these organizations, they vary in size, but they start screaming, "I want a pen test, I want a pen test, I need this." I'm like, "Well, you're a 20-man shop that sells tires. I don't think a pen test is right for you right now. Let's see how we can mature your organization a little bit, so maybe you can get some usability out of said pen test. And so that's where a lot of these assessments come in. The preparedness activities and assessments that I do with people in the community is mainly on the civilian side, your state, local, tribal, territorial. I do have a few people that, you know, have military or DOD type contracts, but basically that's about it. I try to keep it really low. I try not to scare anybody. A lot of people in the South don't like working with the federal government. So when we say assessments, we have to be invited in because they don't like the term audit. And that's a lot what these things really are, but since we don't have a regulatory authority, they're assessments. So, let's see. A lot of what we do for preparedness exercises starts with what's called the cyber performance goals. And that is the basic metrics from last year that we collected just to see how organizations are doing. Are they doing backups? Do they have some conduct controls in place, policies and documentation on procedures? So when Doug, that's been at the county water company for 34 years, decides he wants to quit because he just won the lottery, you know, can somebody come in behind him and do what he did? And guess what the answer always is? Usually no. Bigger cities, it's pretty often it's more documented, but there's still always this one single point of failure, which, like in your organizations, you probably have that and you don't realize it. It could be somewhere in your senior leadership that somebody has to make that decision, approve that ticket, approve that request, buy that piece of technology. After that, we move up the chain for what's called a cyber resilience review, which is checking against the 10 domains of cybersecurity for an organization. My personal favorite is the asset management portion of that. You can't guard what you don't know you have. This section alone just brings a twinkle to my eye when I see the CIO, IT director, their jaws start dropping when their staff and underlings are telling them, oh yeah, we have that, or oh, I don't know about that. A lot of times that's a good one to use. Oh, sorry, I need some feedback there. That's a good assessment to use to figure out, you know, the biggest risk from cyber to cyber events, maybe a cyber to physical event, or a physical to cyber. Physical to cyber is, hey, you know, we don't keep track of our master keys. Somebody has access, you know, to these and we don't know where they're at. So somebody could get into the facility, plug something in or unplug something or, you know, etc. Partnerships, that's a big one I do with a lot of universities, schools, and hospitals. I do this from tabletop exercises, one of the 3 effects that I just mentioned, go through that with them. Another one is our pre-ransomware notification. When we have a program called cyber hygiene, so when an entity signs up for this service, their their internet-facing IPs and devices are scanned, monitored, and they get a weekly report. That also adds them to our pre-ransomware notification, so when there's a hit, or there's something, you know, threat hunt, see something, we can get a hold of those organizations a little faster and head off the path of the ransomware, you know, actor. I like that program. My first year, I actually stopped 2 ransomware attacks in 2 county hospitals in northern Georgia. I'm a big fan of that. Any information you guys want after that, I can come see me and I can set up some time with y'all. Let's see. What's the next slide? All right, I'm going to pass it back over to Clint.
Yeah, so Jason is your local cybersecurity advisor, so reach out to him. He can go over all of our different services. We have so many that weren't even up on the slide there. But just I want to leave you with that the task force is out there for supply chain. You can go out to the task force website and they can give you your essentials. They're going to give you a resource handbook. They're going to talk about, you know, vendor templates, you know, questions that you might want to be asking your vendor and things like that. One of the big assessments we do that Jason can perform for you is that external dependency management. We can actually walk through and say, do you know who your vendors and suppliers are? Do you know your infrastructure? How are you looking at contractors? What's your procurement process look like? We can kind of get down in the weeds with that. And so this is one of the things that you can get from that task force is this essentials guidebook here, which talks about identifying the people in your organization who need to be involved in your supply chain. So obviously procurement, but maybe HR, you know, your cybersecurity team, your operations team, who needs to be involved in securing your supply chain? How are you going to manage the policies around that supply chain? You know, how are you building requirements for anything that comes in? What are the minimum security standards you're looking for? So on and so forth. So I want to leave time for questions here, but this is out there for you. So just go ahead and look at that. And then we're going to get to the questions part here. So I know that you have questions. I see it in your eyes. You've already got a good question. That was a great question, by the way. You have another one? Oh, great. You want the microphone?
So the new buzzword is more ecosystem driven. You're still talking about supply chain, which is often seen as a linear approach. Has CISA considered changing to the word ecosystem cybersecurity?
So buzzwords are great, and they change, they change very fast. So yeah, I will tell you that we do use the word ecosystem. So like Jason talked about tabletop exercises. One of the things that we like to do with our tabletop exercise is that we can tabletop exercise with an individual organization, but the new word that we're using is an ecosystem exercise. And this is where we come in and we exercise with you and your supply chain. Or, even if it's not your supply chain, it might be with your local county. So a lot of organizations, like I just did one for AFC in Atlanta last year, I'm getting ready to do one in November, in which we exercise the city, the county, the airport, the water system, all as one entity, so how each of their individual incident response plans are going to play to that. So CISA is using the word ecosystem. We're not publicizing it a whole lot yet because everybody else is kind of still using supply chain, but I think you will see us start to transition to that as we start to get more, but right now a lot of what we're doing, I can't use the term pilot, so I guess tests, but we're testing how these ecosystems are looking, and I think we actually have a joint cooperation with the DoD right now where we're looking at what does a DoD ecosystem look like, how does a military base in the county and all the things around it work together, how does the power plant work with the military base, those sort of things. So we are looking at it, and that's kind of what AFCEA is really here for too, is to bring all these communities together so we can determine what is an ecosystem. What does a Port of Savannah ecosystem look like versus the Airport of Atlanta ecosystem look like? And how far reaching is an ecosystem? We tend to think of an ecosystem as being a geographic area where a supply chain can stretch across the nation or across the world. So that's kind of how we differentiate those two terms. Ecosystem is a little more local, where supply chain, like you said, is more that linear, but might stretch across the globe. So, good answer?
Well, that'll be an interesting conversation though, because I come from the Netherlands, and we talk ecosystem is bigger than supply chain, which is reverse to what you just said.
Yeah, and that might just be Clint's interpretation, and thank you for coming to the Netherlands. I used to live in the Netherlands over in Soesterberg, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I still root for the Orange in the World Cup. All right, any other questions? But I'll have to talk to you about that, the ecosystem being bigger. Come on, somebody's got to have a question. Even if it's about Star Wars, I'll talk Star Wars, Marvel superheroes. I'm a big geek, so, Marvel question? Zombies, Walking Dead.
Minor question. You were talking about like China spying on people through like different platforms and stuff. Like, what about their computers, like the Lenovo brand specifically? Like, they're like good for like gaming computers. Do you think there's any like spyware embedded on that?
So I'm going to have to take a pass on the Lenovo specific. From my understanding, actually, Lenovo has sold off their computer brand to another company, so I don't know that it is actually fully Chinese owned at this point in time, but there are, if you look at the GSA, there are a few of the Lenovo brands that are actually on GSA, so they have passed rigid security tests and stuff like that. I think that actually, and this is Clint's opinion more, I think, than CISA's opinion, but the Chinese, although they're still looking at a lot of the hardware-based stuff, they're actually shifting focus. You see a lot of the other nation states too, more to game. You talk about gaming. There's a lot going on in social engineering in the gaming communities. So these Minecraft, Roblox, things like that, they're trying to get in there and they're trying to get kids to do things on the home network, to open back doors in for them to get into home networks and things like that, saying, hey, do you want this most recent modification or add on to the game, download it from me, and then they get into, because the kid's probably using mom or dad's computer, right? And mom and dad might be using that computer for work as well, or something like that, or just getting onto the network in general. So they start to do that. So they're using a lot of these gaming platforms in order to gain access through social engineering techniques. And even going so far as to try and start, and people have talked about this with TikTok and stuff like that. I'm not going to get into the TikTok debate, but there have been instances where they're trying to influence how our younger generation, how they view the rest of the world, that they might not, so they're trying to say, hey, China's not so bad, communism's not so bad, that sort of thing. They're doing all that through a lot of these social media and these gaming platforms. Because here in the United States, we do value freedom of speech and stuff like that, so there's very little controls around that, so. Whereas like in the Netherlands and the EU, they're a little bit more, I think they have a lot better privacy policies on a lot of that stuff, on how they're viewing some of that things. You might disagree with me on that, but I think you're stepping in the right direction. You think they're too strict. That's the balance that we have to play, right? How do we protect something that you still make it free at the same time? So I'm in my master's program at the Naval Postgraduate School, so I'm getting a master's in Homeland Security. And this was the fun thing for us, is that the first day the instructors walked in, they said, I bet you think we're going to go around the room and everybody's going to say, who you are, and where you're from, what your background experience is. It's like, we don't care about any of that. What you're going to do instead, there's 32 of you in this class. One by one, you're going to stand up, and you're going to say, this is my definition of Homeland Security. And the other 31 people are going to rip it to shreds. And we're going to keep doing this until we have one definition of Homeland Security. We're 10 months into the program, and we still don't have a definition that we all agree on. How do you defend something if nobody can decide what the definition of that something is? I ask each, if we were to go around this room right now and I ask each of you, what is cyber? We would have more definitions than we have people in the room. How do we defend cyber if we can't even tell what it is? Is it every Nest thermostat? Is it every Ring doorbell? Is it every little module that plugs into a car? Is it the little USB fan that goes into a thing? What is cyber? And, we talk about, there's a cyber skills gap out there and stuff like that. Well, that's because they keep expanding what the definition of cyber is, that everything new that comes out, that they can't put it into a nice little bucket, guess what? It gets thrown into cyber. And so what we have to know, what we have to defend keeps decreasing and increasing. And there's got to be a point where we have to say that bubble's got to pop at some point where we say, this is cyber, this is all we can defend. All we're expected to defend, but we're not there yet. So right now we're trying to defend everything. And as Jason pointed out, the very first thing in the cyber resilience review, the best assessment that we have, the very first thing that we do is asset management. It takes us most of the day to do asset management. And what we find out is most organizations don't even know what their assets are. They know they have data, but they don't know what the data is. They've never classified that data. They don't know whether it's HIPAA data, whether it's NERC-CIP data, whether it's company confidential, intellectual property. Every time I go in and do incident response for organizations, the first thing they want to do is protect their crown jewels. And we say, okay, where are your crown jewels? And they say they're right here. And then we do a network scan, and guess where we find them? Everywhere but right there. Because Bob wanted to take them home to work on them, or Mary needed to collaborate with Sally on them, or somebody distributed them to the cloud in order to get some work from home on them. If you don't know what you have, how are you protecting it? And that is the key to everything. And that's where we're at as a nation. It's just terminology. We're not even using the same terms. I'm using ecosystem in one way, the Netherlands is using ecosystem in another way. And we find this as I work with a lot of countries across the globe. What I think is a general term for us, that's not the same term that they use there. We talk privacy here, they talk privacy differently there. I've tried talking with the Germans about privacy and their idea of privacy. I think, do you think yours is strict? I think theirs is even worse. That's where we're at, is we don't even have a common lexicon. So how are we defending it? So now think through your supply chain. Think through your contract language. You've written something in that contract. Are you interpreting it the same way they're interpreting it? I find out most of the time that's a no. And that's why we're recommending tabletop exercises with your supply chain. You can't tabletop exercise by yourself. You have to do it with your ecosystem, your supply chain. You have to do it with everybody, because what you think their understanding is might not be the real understanding. The number of times that we've gone to do incident response for an organization and we've pushed everything and figured out that the cloud was somehow involved, and we've asked the cloud to help us out, and the cloud has said, in order for us to give you that information, you're going to have to get a subpoena. You know how long it takes to get a subpoena? If you don't involve the FBI, it takes even longer. The FBI can get one pretty quick. But imagine that you're trying to get back up in operation, you're trying to recover from a cyber attack, and they're telling you you need a subpoena. You're dead in the water until you get that subpoena. if you didn't exercise with them to know that that's their process, or you didn't have it in the contract that they must release that within X amount of hours. The number of organizations I've gone into where they're like, hey, we have a requirement that this system can only be down for X number of hours. And then I'll look through their contracts and be like, okay, it's funny that you say that that system can only be down for 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, but you realize that your contract with HP or your contract with Dell says they have 72 hours to get you parts. How are you going to meet a 4-hour turnaround time if they have 72 hours to get you parts? And they don't know, because they wrote their security language to say this is what our requirements for security are, but their contracts don't match their requirements. Any other questions? I have 2 minutes. Yes, sir.
I'll just try to project. So, in order for a supply chain to work with DoD, they have to meet particular cybersecurity foundational elements, right? So they have to be able to meet a certain baseline.
He's trying not to say CMMC, but he's saying CMMC.
So they have to meet a baseline, right? So, in order for outside the size of or CISA, however you pronounce it, in order for them to offer their nonprofit services and services that you guys offer to other businesses, are there independent foundations that are out there like NSF and like your supplements like vitamins and minerals and stuff? NSF would be like an independent organization that certifies whether that vitamin is good or not. Are there some things like that that certifies supply chains within the civilian world outside of CISA that would do their profit services?
I have not heard of any. I mean, so obviously you have FedRAMP, which FedRAMP is an independent organization that does, for cloud and things like that. And that's one of the things that I think as a nation that we're struggling with is how do we validate whether somebody is trusted or not, GSA, I always tell people that, a good benchmark, if it's on GSA, that means it's gone through some security testing. Better Business Bureau is another good, mark and things like that. So that's about all I can tell you at this point in time. I'll go back to my headquarters and ask if you want to send that to me in an email. I'll try to get you a better answer on that. But I mean, we're looking at software building materials, hardware building materials. I mean, that's what CISA's approach is going to be, is to start mandating that we do find a little bit better way. And we're asking people to do it voluntarily right now. But if people don't do it voluntarily, I think it's going to have to become a regulation. But we're looking at, say, how do we have a third party that can look at these things? The Georgia Cyber Center, I think they've offered people in the past that they have the range there. Hey, if you want to bring your stuff into the range, the Army can hit it with everything that they've got, and then that's not going to give you like a third-party certification, but it's at least going to give you an idea of what that application, what that software looks like. There's other places out there that do those kind of cyber range type issues too. A lot of the national labs, I think, can help you along those lines, but I don't know of any particular thing out there. All right, I want to thank everybody for coming today. Hope you learned something.